just about 5:30, so I think I will get us started. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Marina Wells. I'm Assistant Curator of History and Culture here at the New Bedford Whaling Museum in New Bedford, Massachusetts, the port from which Melville himself departed on a whaling voyage almost exactly 185 years ago. And on that voyage that inspired Moby Dick. So thank you all so much for participating in our Moby-Dick Book Club. We hope that you will stay connected with the museum even after tonight. This is our final session of the book club. Perhaps you'll remain connected as a member. You might already be familiar with our benefits, the benefits of becoming a member, things like free admission and store discounts. But there are also some perks that are directly pertinent to this book club. So, for example, we have an upcoming members holiday party that you can join us at the museum, and at that you'll get to see a special sneak peek of our show, Ahab's Head, American Vengeance, which is an installation by artist Heidi Whitman. We also have an upcoming lecture with the Melville scholars that you've met here, and that is hosted the night before the Moby-Dick Marathon on January 2nd. And as members, you get a $25 discount to those dinner tickets. You also, looking very far ahead, but in 2027, you get priority early access to become a reader for Moby Dick Marathon next year. And those spots just fly. So that's a pretty important perk and something exciting. But to the text. This is our third and final session of this book club. It's been such a pleasure. We really appreciate you being along for this ride. Maybe you have succeeded in swimming through this text with us this fall. Maybe you have sailed along as a passenger. All are welcome tonight. So to help us along on this final whalebone leg of this journey, we have two renowned Melville scholars with us here tonight, Professors Mary K. Burkaw Edwards of the University of Connecticut and Jennifer Baker of New York University. Each is unparalleled in their expertise, and we're so grateful that the two of you are here with us tonight. Thank you for being here. They have offered us some questions on the reading guide, which is available on our website. You probably got an email reminder with that as well. The theme for tonight is Melville and the ocean, just about as broad as you can get, but we hope this will leave room for interpretation for reader questions and conversation. We welcome you to use the Q&A function to submit your own questions you'd like to ask the scholars, and we can unmute you so that you can ask the questions live. We also welcome you to use that chat function as folks are doing right now to introduce yourselves. Maybe tonight, if you'd like to introduce yourself and include your favorite Melvillian phrase that you've encountered in this text now that we're all the way through the book. I know it's hard to choose, but that's a fun question to chew on. There are so many wonderful wordy words in this book. So please talk amongst yourselves in the chat. And we really just appreciate you taking the time to spend on these Tuesday nights with us and be a part of this community, share in this text with us, and participate in our sort of larger global museum community. We are really appreciative of this overwhelmingly positive response, and we're sort of floating the possibility of doing another iteration next year. So stay tuned. These sessions have been recorded. They are available on YouTube for those of you who want to return to them. And this one will also be recorded and posted up there as well. But to get right into it, the drama's done. Let's hear from our Melville scholars, and we'll start with Mary Kay. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Marina. Uh, so Herman Melville was a sailor first, and it was as a sailor he was identified by his literary contemporaries in the 19th century. Everett Duyking famously wrote to his brother George in 1848, By the way, Melville reads old books. He has borrowed Sir Thomas Browne of me and says finally of the speculations of the Religio Medici that Browne is a kind of cracked archangel. Was ever anything of this sort said before by a sailor? I've always loved that quote because I started as a sailor before I was a scholar. And, it's like, yeah, sailors can say intelligent things too. Um, so Melville's sailor identity was a form of transgression. He did not fit the general understanding of what it meant to be a writer in the 19th century. Throughout his life, Melville both fought against and embraced his sailor identity. Melville was at sea for 4 years, working as a crew member on board a merchant vessel, three whale ships, and a naval frigate. His longest continuous time at sea was aboard the whale ship Acushnet, which, as Marina mentioned, sailed from New Bedford on January 3rd, well, actually from Fairhaven on January 3rd, 1841, where he learned about whaling not only intellectually and emotionally, but also kinesthetically. That kinesthetic knowledge of the ship, the sea, and whales underlies Moby Dick. A sailing ship is a place of performance, whether depicted explicitly as a stage or implicitly as a place in which one performs. Cesare Casarino writes of the ship in Joseph Conrad's The Secret Sharer as, quote, the stage on which the whole story is about to unfold. Melville overtly renders the ship as stage in Moby Dick at the beginning of the quarterdeck, chapter 36, through the use of stage directions. Enter Ahab, then all. And the beginning of the deck towards the end of the first night watch, chapter 120. Ahab standing by the helm, Starbuck approaching him. Even lacking such explicit references, the theater like qualities of the ship are undeniable, with the quarterdeck as stage and the rigging alternating between a platform for performance and an arena for the audience. The ship, ethnohistorian Greg Denning argues, in all its spaces, in all its relationships, and all its theater, was always being remade, was always in process. The quote, power of the captain was public, impersonal, dependent on rituals of reification and signs of distance. Aboard the HMS Bounty, Captain William Bligh's inability to perform correctly, including his improper use of the language of command, led to his overthrow by Fletcher Christian and the other mutineers. Sailor identity is intertwined with storytelling. Ishmael, according to Margaret Cohen, is, quote, an indifferent seaman but a remarkable narrator. Although I agree that Ishmael is a remarkable narrator, I disagree with Cohen's assessment of his seafaring. He may have been a drowsy lookout in the masthead, chapter 35, and fallen into, quote, a brief standing sleep in the try works, chapter 96. But elsewhere, he is a good seaman, able to weave a mat in the mat maker, chapter 47, trusted to manage the deck end of the line attached to Queequeg in the monkey rope, chapter 72, and advanced to bow oarsman in the same chapter. Most importantly, he is part of the quietly competent crew of the Queequeg. For the narrators of Melville's first 6 books, their identity as sailors who perform seafaring labor is inextricable from storytelling. Literary critic Walter Benjamin makes the connection between work and storytelling explicit. Quote, traces of the storyteller cling to the story the way the handprints of the potter cling to the clay vessel. So Ishmael invites us into the story of Moby Dick with his first words, call me Ishmael. Tonight we will discuss the end of his story. I'll turn it over to Jennifer.
Hello. So tonight we're going to discuss chapters 96 through the epilogue, and I just wanted to say a few words about the plotting of these chapters and how they function in the overall narrative arc of the book. I know that Moby Dick is notoriously digressive, and even Ishmael jokes about its lack of anything resembling a narrative. But we do see in this last group of chapters the outlines of a story coming to a grand conclusion. Perhaps most obviously, after so many philosophical and meditative chapters packed into the book's center, Ahab's pursuit of vengeance comes back into view in chapters like the doubloon and the candles, when the crew recommits to Ahab's quest for the white whale. In other chapters, Ahab prepares for battle, forging a new harpoon, for example, baptized in pagan blood, and it seems like we are finally going to meet the white whale we've been hearing so much about. The narrative tension builds as the Pequod seems propelled toward doom. In the Gam with the Samuel Enderby, for example, Ahab is given an example of a whaling captain who has also lost a limb to Moby-Dick and chosen not to pursue him any further. When Captain Boomer says of the white whale, he's best let alone, Ahab rejects the advice and turns his back on the ship. In the encounter with the Delight, Ahab also ignores the sad burial of a sailor killed by the white whale. These chapters, of course, are also filled with omens, a life buoy that sinks like a stone, a hawk that snatches Ahab's hat and drops it into the sea, and lots of prophecy, Fadala's most notably. The failure of the ship's nautical instruments and the quadrant, the needle, and the log and line make clear that the Pequod is on the wrong course. So as Ahab rejects each opportunity to change course, the Pequod's demise seems more and more inevitable. At the same time, we see Ishmael's own story developing. The first chapter for tonight, the Try-Works, is one which many readers, myself included, consider pivotal for the development of his character. Early in the book, Ishmael recalls that he backed Ahab's quest fully. His shouts had gone up with the rest of the crew during the quarterdeck scene, and Ahab's quenchless feud seemed his. But in a squeeze of the hand, he refers to that oath as horrible. And in chapter 96, as he gazes at the hellish Try-Works, he feels horribly conscious of something fatally wrong. Ishmael concludes that chapter saying that one should not give thyself up to fire, lest it invert thee, deaden thee, adding that there is wisdom that is woe, but there is a woe that is madness. In the end, why does Ishmael survive? He suggests a combination of luck and destiny. He says it so chanced that the fates ordained he should go into Ahab's boat, be moved off the Pequod and out of harm's way. But Ishmael has also chosen an alternative path to Ahab's. Floating peacefully on the sea in the book's final moment, he models a relationship to animals that is not combative, a kind of kinship with nature that has been evident in many of the meditative chapters. And when he's picked up by the Rachel and brought into its surrogate family, this makes sense because we've seen in earlier chapters that he's thinking about whether happiness can be located not in the intellect, but in domestic relations. And just one final thought. If we think about the epilogue in relation to the novel's opening chapter, we see also that Ishmael has not just survived the wreck of the Pequod, but he's a survivor more generally. Ishmael tells us in Loomings that he always goes to sea when he's feeling down. And actually, the blacksmith Perth also, we're told, went to sea when he lost his family and felt desperate. So it's hard to imagine that Ishmael would ever board a ship again after what happens to the Pequod, but apparently he does. He refers to those subsequent voyages. So his feeling out of sorts seems to be a regular occurrence, and his survival is ongoing. Seafaring is what he does in order to survive. And we might think about Moby-Dick as a post-trauma narrative about how humans process and cope with distress.
Thank you both so much for kicking us off with these topics, so thinking about Melville, Ishmael, the ocean. And I think Claire has a question perhaps related to this, one of our main characters here.
Uh,
Claire, would you like to ask?
yeah, is my audio okay? Sorry, I'm on
Yes,
my AirPods.
it's great.
Yeah, my question was like, do we ever get kind of an explanation from Melville of why he's chosen this like self-aware narrator format? Um, Ishmael like directly acknowledges like the readers, the process of writing, etc. I was just wondering, like, I kept asking myself why. Yeah.
You want to say something, Jennifer?
Well, the question is whether Melville talked about why he created Ishmael the way he did, and what about Ishmael interests you? What about his character? I think you said something about self-awareness.
Yeah, like we see Ishmael talk about like the process of like writing the book, kind of addressing that there are readers who will be interacting with the text. And I just found that kind of unusual as opposed to it being like a more straightforward narrative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there are really two Ishmaels in the book. There's Ishmael, the young sailor, who participates in the event on the Pequod. And then there's Ishmael, the older man, who is telling the story years later and with hindsight. So he's looking back on his younger self. And so I think in a chapter like the Try-Works, he is very self-aware. He's aware of this change that occurred. He's aware of the charisma that Ahab held for him, and then aware of the need to distance himself from Ahab in order to survive. There are a number of characters in Melville's writing that are closely based on his own life. Not that we want to think about Melville and Ishmael as interchangeable, because they're not. But there are many things about Ishmael that remind us of Melville. I would note also that Ishmael was a type of character for Melville that he actually talked about in prior books. So in the book Redburn, that young sailor, who is obviously based a little bit on Melville's own life, describes himself as feeling like a kind of Ishmael. So the notion of Ishmael as a stock character who's an outlier, an outsider, an orphan, this is something that appealed to Melville and must have been a kind of character that he himself identified with. Mary Kay, did you want
Yeah,
to?
I was just going to add that, I've always thought it was really interesting that we actually don't know his real name. He says, "Call me Ishmael." And the first six books that Melville wrote, we never they all the narrators have a name that's imposed upon them instead of their real name, except for Redburn. But Redburn, his name is Wellingborough Redburn, but as soon as he comes on board the ship, the I think it's one of the old sailors says, "Buttons, I will call you Buttons." So even he doesn't get to have a real name. And that, you know, it, to tie back to what I was talking about earlier, that really just shows him as storyteller too. And you see, like Jennifer said, there's two Ishmaels, and you really see the older Ishmael. You see him in various places throughout the whole book, but you really see him in the beginning of the Town Ho chapter.
Mm, mhm.
I am wondering if you would be willing to talk on this subject about his tattooing. The part where he's uh reflecting back on this scene where would you be willing to chat about that? Because I don't think I certainly have been confounded by that moment, just in terms of the looking back on
Which moment when he's
Yeah.
talking about tattooing the measurements
Yeah,
on
that's what I was wondering
young?
if that's the one you were
it. Yeah,
meant to. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because Queequeg's tattooed all over, and then do we really don't know until that moment that Ishmael's tattooed as well? And then in fact he talks about leaving a small space to put in a poem that he's writing. So then we see then he is tattooed, and of course Moby Dick in his essence is like a tattoo because sperm whales were so scarred by the giant squid, their battles with the giant squid, that their skin looks like hieroglyphics, almost like tattoos. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
Yeah, I'm just curious about these different parts of Ishmael that we don't know much about, right? That become sort of layered or revealed throughout the text. Um,
And it's an
and
interesting use of tattooing because we know from earlier books like Typee that tattooing really makes the white body kind of foreign. And the fear of the main character in Typee is that as he is living among these people, they will tattoo his face and he will become kind of incapable of reintegrating into white society. So tattooing is on the face, kind of takes you out of white society. And yet we know that sailors were very fond of tattooing their bodies. You know, Mary Kay may know more about this, but also tattooing numbers in a poem was not your normal way of tattooing, I don't think.
And I also have thought it's so interesting that Melville seems to have Melville himself seems to have this, he's appalled by the marring of the human body. I mean, you see it again and again. He's so appalled in Taipei, like Jennifer was just talking about the idea of being tattooed. When Karki, I love that name because it's so shark-like. Karki is interested in tattooing him. He's just like that interesting tattooing Tomo in Taipei. It's just so overwhelming to him. But Ahab's body is marred. There's very because he's lost his leg. There's just like Melville himself seems to have a revulsion against anything that doesn't keep the human body perfect.
yeah, this is a theme that comes up over and over again. And I guess I turning to a question perhaps related to tangentially related to this, to sort of, yeah, self-effacement. Mark has a question for you.
Hello, Marina. This is Mark. First of all, a quick comment. Big thank you to the Whaling Museum for putting together this group read of Moby Dick. It's the thing that got me across the finish line to actually read Moby Dick after like a number of failed efforts. So big thanks to the museum and to you personally for putting this program into the public sphere. It was marvelous, and I hope you do it again next year. I would participate. Here's the question. So over the final like third of this book, every now and then this thought would pop into my mind as Ahab is hunting Moby Dick, seeking vengeance. Isn't he, meaning Ahab, also hunting his own death? As a devout Quaker, he was unable to commit suicide because that would have just ruined his family back on Nantucket forever. So he needs an agent to hasten him off this mortal coil. And isn't Moby Dick just the guy for the job to get that done? Any comments from your scholars on that?
I haven't thought of it that way.
Yeah. Neither had I, but that I find that really interesting. And the idea of suicide is right there at the beginning of the book. And I'd never thought of Ahab's quest that way, but I find it really intriguing. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, one way that Ahab is often thought of as needing the chase and needing the whale because his whole identity and purpose is wrapped up in the whale. Kind of the way the Victor Frankenstein and the creature he creates have this relationship, and Victor needs the creature in many ways and is locked into pursuit at the end of that novel. So I haven't thought about Ahab as on a suicide mission, although he clearly is willing to risk his life to in pursuit of the whale, which is why the death of Ahab is so interesting, that he really doesn't have a long drawn out battle or showdown with the whale after all of this. That his death is so quick. It's one sentence. You could miss it if you weren't reading carefully. And he really doesn't have the kind of final moment with the whale that he wants, right?
Yeah, I've always, always, always loved the death of Ahab. I think it's just one of the most brilliant moments of Melville's writing there, because when my students are reading it, lots of times they're like, "Huh? What just happened? Is Ahab gone?" And the fact that he's also speechless. Ahab exerts so much power throughout the whole book with language and using his voice, and then he's just gone. Yeah, I love it.
And of course, you know that in the John Huston movie, that's not what happens to Ahab, that Ahab ends up bound to the whale, which in the book is what happens to Fedallah. And that Ahab really does have that final encounter with the whale where they're locked into combat because Ahab is strapped to the whale and plunging away with whatever whatever sharp implement he has in his hand. And Ray Bradbury, who wrote the screenplay for John Huston, felt that Melville would have really liked the change that he introduced at the end. But I have to think Melville knew what he was doing, and he denies Ahab the kind of death that he wants, right?
Yeah, I
Pulled
totally
over.
agree.
And I've had students say, well, do you think he's dragged along behind the whale, or is he just pulled over and then sinks to the bottom of the sea right away? If he's dragged along behind, it might be a little more satisfying, but we don't know.
Yeah, I totally agree. I've always loved that Ray Bradbury quotation, and like, no, you're wrong, Ray. Melville did it right. Melville's so much more powerful. Yeah.
Yeah, we had James on deck with a similar question. I don't know if you want to extrapolate on this at all, James.
Um, yes, can I be heard?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. I want to share that I also love this book club, and it was great to read the book with everybody listening and with these professors. Um, my question was in the Q&A, and it was basically about, you addressed the first part about Ahab's death and why such a short disappearance has such power over the literary imagination of the book. But I'd also love to know why the whale's attack seems brief also. I found it to be very brief and not as satisfying as I'd hoped. Still interesting, and I'd love to hear your analysis of why the actual strike that takes the boat down gets such a short, one sentence about hatred before it happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm wondering, did you find all three of the chase chapters a little disappointing or anticlimactic? Was it less than what you expected after chapters and chapters of buildup?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
The chase was fun. I expected more detail about the attack and the destruction of the ship.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps I'm revealing some alignment of my own, but I found it to be, I was looking for a lot more detail.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, one thing I think is important to keep in mind is that Melville's very interested in the whale being an actual whale. That after all these chapters of sailors' yarns and tall tales and mythology, he uses this language of stripping down the whale to what is empirically verifiable. So he doesn't want an animal that is like a Godzilla. What I really don't like about that Ron Howard movie In the Heart of the Sea is that the whale is so ridiculously big that it no longer even resembles an actual whale. I think Melville was very interested in giving us a whale that one could actually have seen out at sea, even if that whale was remarkable in its behaviors and in its size. This is a remarkable animal, but it's not beyond the bounds of what's possible. And notice that in those three chase scenes, everything that the whale does are things that had been recorded by sailors. So coming up under the whale boat. That was commonly depicted in paintings, breaching, a kind of incredible thing to witness, but not something unheard of. And then, of course, the last act of the whale is something that had already been recorded and popularized through the story of the Essex. So these might be remarkable things, but they're not impossible. And I think Melville is after that. He is not after a kind of King Kong, Godzilla type creature.
So could I sneak in one related question, Professor?
Of course.
I gather that one of you, I think it's the one who's just been speaking, Professor, that there's so your work has been about how this book gained the primacy in the current canon that it has, and the emergence of it during maybe the post-World War II period. I found that to be an interesting question. Perhaps it's why I was expecting a Godzilla ending, was because I'm sort of from this era.
Right. I mean, Godzilla is a kind of Cold War phenomenon, but the Moby-Dick as a Cold War book, as a book that really was embraced by American academics after World War II, was embraced not so much because of the whale, but because of Ahab. That Ahab was seen as a tyrannical figure, and it was this showdown between the tyranny of Ahab and a kind of democratic crew that really interested American academics at the time.
I mean, tyrannical, but also charismatic too. So that
Yes.
the charisma of Ahab, and just thinking back on the charisma of Hitler and things like that. Like how did people like that get everybody on their side? Yeah.
Folks should feel comfortable to toss any and all questions into the Q&A. Before we move on too far from this final scene, Charles has a related question.
Hi. My question really goes towards how much did Melville know about the story of the Essex? I mean, I know that the captain of the Essex was from Nantucket and returned to Nantucket and did take off another ship that he also lost. Just curious how much influence the story or the history of Essex had on this novel. My other thing is just out to the group, anyone in visiting New Bedford, visiting the museum, if they want the opportunity to row in a replica of whaleboats. Unfortunately, the wooden one is no longer in the water, but there are fiberglass whaleboats that are pretty much the same size, the same everything, same setup, no sailing rigs, but just rowing. If anyone wants to experience rowing a whaleboat, it can be arranged for you.
I can answer about the Essex. So Melville read Owen Chase's narrative when he was still whaling. So he knew the Owen Chase narrative. He did meet Pollard, Captain Pollard, but he didn't meet him until after Moby Dick was published. The first time Melville visited Nantucket was in 1852. Of course, Moby Dick was published in 1851. But he'd actually read the Owen Chase narrative out at sea, and he wrote about it. The reading of this narrative upon the landless sea. I can't remember the entire quotation, but it's about that. And then he requested through his father-in-law to get a copy of Owen Chase, and his father-in-law got him a copy of the narrative, but it was interesting. It was missing some pages, but so he remembered the story, and then he reread the narrative when he was actually doing the writing.
So there's so much to talk about. Keep putting the questions that you have in the chat, everybody, or in the Q&A rather. I I'm wondering, as we're thinking about this brief scene of violence at the end, I was saying before we got on, I was telling Mary Kay I don't like horror films, but there's part of this that reminds me of, the scariness and the anticipation of uh, this final culmination at the end. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about these chapters, the quadrant, the needle, the log and line, and that sort of anticipation of this fated end as we reach the final chapters.
Well, I've always loved the fact that with those ones you just specifically mentioned, every navigation instrument upon navigation instrument is being destroyed. And I'm always intrigued by people who don't have a sense of what's going to happen at the end of Moby Dick. I feel like the whole book, like you can tell right from the beginning this is not going to end well. And then when they're like surprised, I'm always shocked because it feels like Melville just fills the book with doom and foreboding all the way through, but especially the destruction of a navigational instrument upon navigational instrument. There is no way this ship is going to make it back to Nantucket, with all those being destroyed. Yeah.
And the significance of the materiality of sailing there, right? Um, so we have some more questions related to some of the questions, the prompts that are on the reading guide there. Um, James has another question. You want to go ahead and ask that, James?
Um, Hello again. Just I I found the chapter about Perth losing his family to drink and then becoming a blacksmith. Sorry, is it blacksmith or carpenter on the boat?
Blacksmith.
To be
Yeah.
really fascinating upon rereading as well. Um, are there what are scholars saying about that and about Perth's role on the boat?
Well, it's a kind of parallel story to Ishmael in some ways. I mean, we don't know what's going on with Ishmael. We don't know whether to take seriously this idea that that seafaring is a substitute for pistol and ball. Is he really set on killing himself? We don't know, but the idea of the sea as salvific and seafaring as kind of restorative, I think it's paralleled, at least in his impulse to go to sea. But was there another question in there?
I mean, I would just add that it's
Mm-hmm.
interesting, like you mentioned at the beginning, Jennifer, with the Samuel Enderby.
Mm-hmm.
Where's and then and with Perth, you get so sucked into the story that you kind of believe there's only one thing that Ahab can do. And then Melville throws in these other things, and it's like, oh yeah, Captain Boomer lost he lost an arm, but he's not going to chase, he says ain't one arm enough, ain't one limb enough. He doesn't have to chase the white whale. And then Perth, Perth is steeped in woe just like Ahab is, but Perth just keeps going doing his job, and there so you sort of forget as you're so wrapped up in Ahab that there are other answers, that you don't have to do what Ahab does.
Yeah, will you say a little more about those final encounters with other ships, the other sort of gams that take place towards the end? We get a handful of gams in this text. I'm also wondering if maybe Jennifer has some thoughts about sort of the idea of caretaking related to those gams, or sort of the relationship between the different ships and the orphan we see at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I know, I'm just looking at my table of contents for all these gams. The Samuel Enderby, I noted. I mean, I think both the Samuel Enderby gam and the Delight gam, we have a sense of foreboding, and Ahab just turns his back on any alternative to pursuing the quest. But what else do we have? We have the Pequod meets the Bachelor, which is an interesting game because unlike the Delight, which has encountered all sorts of misfortune, the Bachelor has been incredibly lucky. They have so much oil, they don't know what to do with it. They've put it in all sorts of containers, and now they are actually tearing up the try-works and throwing the bricks overboard, and they're going back home. And we should think about the word bachelor, which comes up a lot in Melville's writing. And what is a bachelor? I think one of the defining qualities of the bachelor for Melville is the freedom from responsibility, right? That the bachelor in many of their stories don't have the responsibility of wife and family. I think in this instance, the bachelor represents a kind of carefree quality, and that this ship is not bound by any quest, any oath for vengeance. And so it's a very dramatic foil to the Pequod, which is bound to pursue the whale because they've committed to this quest.
And I also think, again and again, Melville, he uses that term bachelor, like Jennifer says, and he also kind of questions it, like it seems like totally joyous. The whole scene with the bachelor and they're throwing over the try-works, which in actual fact was a real thing that they did at the end of a voyage, partly to open up the deck to make sure that where the water, like a vat of water that was under the try-works, to make sure that it hadn't rotted the deck, partly because the bricks were all grimed, so that's why they throw them overboard. But they are so caught up in their own joy and and um and having a good time that they're oblivious to anything else. And I think Neville's really questions that obliviousness. He does it in Paradise of Bachelors, like Tony mentioned in the chat. Um, and and so there's the character like Stubb, who's not oblivious, but he's deciding, for Stubb will always be jolly, and think not is my 11th command, and sleep when you can is my 12th. I know sleep when you can is my 11th command, and think, I can't remember which order it goes, but so Melville does question the kind of obliviousness that comes with kind of joy. That isn't the perfect answer either.
Mhm.
So I love having the bachelor way there at the end. And then of course we've got Rachel, which is one of the most heartbreaking chapters of
Mhm.
all, and then
Mhm.
Delight. And Delight is so obviously a terrible name for that boat, but it's just like when you see the Delight, and they had just encountered Moby Dick the day before, that should be another sign that things are not going to go well for the Pequod.
Mhm. Mhm.
We have a funny follow-up question from John. John, it looks like you're unmuted, but we can't hear you.
Hmm. Maybe he
Well,
can put the question in the chat.
yeah. So John has this funny question asking sort of about Melville's own life and his marriage and the relationship to being a bachelor. He asks, was the bachelor theme wishful thinking?
Mm.
Complicated answer, I think.
Yeah, I don't know enough to know. I mean, it could have been partly wishful thinking, but yeah. What do you think, Jennifer?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think biographers have noted that their marriage seemed strained often, that Melville wasn't an easy person to live with. And there are stories that he might have even been abusive, but it's speculation. But I don't know. If you go to Arrowhead, the house where Melville completed Moby-Dick and you go up to the second floor, you're struck by the fact that it's very small and cramped. There were a lot of people living up there. There was Melville, his wife, his kids, his at least one sister, his mother. I don't know if they were all there at once or rotated in and out, but there were a lot of people. And a very large chunk of that space is his study, filled with books and a table pushed up against the window overlooking Mount Greylock. And so you have this sense that, he didn't write this book on a ship. He didn't write it in a seaport inn. He wrote it in a home filled with women and children, a very domestic space. And people are curious to know if some of that domesticity comes out in the book itself. But we also know that he relied on members of his family to help with writing and copy editing. We also know that his wife and other women in his family were very, very dedicated to keeping his works in print after he died. So there's a way in which the women and family life and marriage really supports his authorship. So I don't know if he would have wanted to be a bachelor.
And I would just add too, like with what I was saying earlier, I mean, he's got so many questions about bachelorhood and and obliviousness and stuff like that. So that makes me a question as well. I did see in the chat somebody asked, "Does Moby Dick die in the end?" And no, and Josh Sanchez, who created this beautiful 51-foot by 14-foot mural kind of about Moby Dick called Or the Whale. He has another drawing that he did that says there are two survivors. Everybody always thinks of the end of the book as having one survivor. Ishmael is the survivor. But in fact, there are two, Ishmael and Moby Dick. So, yeah.
I have a
Yeah, go ahead. Rita has a mystery question.
oh yes. And I have a question about Ahab and at the beginning of the book, when Peleg and Bildad are sort of marketing, I would say, Ahab as a captain, when Ishmael's inquiring as to who the captain is, and they're quite they gush, that he's above the common, he's a ungodly, godlike man. I mean, they really are pushing him forward, and then they talk about the time when he went around below the Cape, and there was a terrible storm, and I think the mast broke off, and he saved that whole ship. So you kind of get the idea that Ahab was an incredible seaman, impeccable captain, and somebody that was greatly admired in the whaling community. And then, of course, when he has his encounter with Moby Dick and he loses his leg and he spends those fitful times in the hammock, and that's sort of this transformation where he becomes he changes, and so you sort of think, well, Peleg and Bildad are kind of hoping that goes away, that's not true, that he's still going to be this great captain that's going to bring back whaling oil. So my question is, Starbuck also seems above the common. He seems to be he could be an incredible whaling captain himself. Do you think that Starbuck is a young Ahab? Do you think that Melville has a contrast there, that we have the young Ahab in the form of Starbuck on the ship at the same time?
I would say no. But I'm glad you've brought this out, because in that chapter and in other chapters, it's very clear that Ahab has his humanities, as we're told. I love the first time we see Ahab, he's pacing around on deck, and he's actually trying to be quiet with his one bone leg, because he knows that the sailors are sleeping right underneath the deck and he doesn't want to wake them up. But as he gets more and more obsessed with the whale and angry, he starts stomping and making noise. There is a desire to do the right thing in Ahab, but he's too consumed with vengeance, and can't really override that. I think the difference between Ahab and Starbuck is that Starbuck is safe to a fault, and he's risk averse for various reasons, as we've been told. And I think there is something admirable in that, but it kind of keeps him on a different level from Ahab, if that makes sense. Starbuck has a point that they're there to hunt whales and bring home oil and make money. But Ahab wants something higher than that. We may not agree with that. We may see how deadly that is. But I do think Melville takes seriously the idea that Ahab is of a finer nature, even if he's misguided by his desire for vengeance. Mary Kay, what do you think?
Oh yeah, I agree. I mean, Starbuck, Starbuck is at the end, you always have questions. If Starbuck had actually shot Ahab, he would have saved everybody, but then we would have had a lot of questions about him as a murderer. I mean, Starbuck, um, he's the righteous man, but is righteousness enough? And also, is there something beyond, like Jennifer was suggesting, about Ahab being great, Peleg, as somebody mentioned him earlier, Peleg said Ahab's a grand, ungodly, godlike man. And, that I feel like Melville really appreciates Ahab's quest to break through the wall, to break through the boundaries that make us human and to get to the other side, he's a Promethean figure. He wants somehow to gain the knowledge of gods. And, I think Melville's suggesting that it's not possible, but there's something powerful in his attempt to do that.
Mhm.
And yeah, so I was shaking my head too, and you asked if Starbucks sort of a young Ahab. No, I think they're different. And so when I ask my students, is Ahab evil? I mean, Ahab kills everybody on the ship, but they never can see him as evil. They always they are always struck by that, as Jennifer said, he has his humanities, and that humanity in him keeps us caring about him, and not being able to. He's so much more complex than just a tyrant or an evil character.
Mhm.
I just want to say one last thing about bachelors. That Peleg, because they're Quakers, they don't swear. I love how Melville has him say "son of a bachelor" instead. So it's, as long as we're talking about bachelors, I just had to say that.
Great.
Yeah, Mary Kay described Ahab as Promethean. I love thinking about Ahab in similarities to Victor Frankenstein too, who is the modern Prometheus, according to Mary Shelley. And this is someone also who wants to break through the bounds of what's possible for humans, but does so in a way that's deadly for those around him.
Well, on the topic of complex characters, Patty has a question. I have a feeling Mary Kay might have thoughts.
Yes, thank you. Lily, I've always been interested in the character of Fedallah because, for one reason, he feels much less complex to me than many of these other characters. We really only see him, many of the other characters call him the devil. We don't really get any sense of his good side or why he cares enough about this to be along for a voyage that he knows will end badly. I also am really interested in how much Melville knew about Zoroastrianism or India. Like, where do you think are some of the places he got the inspiration for this character or what he was trying to do with this character? I just find him a really kind of fascinating figure in the book.
So Melville, he had access to Pierre Bale's, which is like an encyclopedia of various religions, and that's where he got most of his information about the various religions. But he gets it kind of mixed up. So people are who will know one or the other of things he references or get frustrated with him, but it's partly because he was gathering his knowledge from an encyclopedia. Um, I Fadala is the character that I have the hardest time with. Every time I teach Moby Dick, there's a part of me that hopes the students will never ask about Fadala because I don't know what to do with him as a character. I'd love to know if Jennifer has more insight into him.
No, I don't. And I mean, he's such a mishmash of uh, kind of different Asian cultures and Eastern cultures that he really doesn't feel like a fully developed individual so much as a type.
Sometimes I think maybe he's just a doppelganger of Ahab. Sometimes,
Mhm.
he's a double or he's half of Ahab and half not. There's a scene where like, they're looking down and he seems to just be a part of Ahab's shadow. He's just, yeah, I feel like he's not fully developed and I'm just never sure exactly what to do with him.
Well, we're coming up towards the end of our time here, and related to the ending, John has a question.
Hi, thanks so much for doing this. My question was about the first edition that eliminated the epilogue. And I'm wondering if you had any insight into why, I think it was Richard Bentley or the British publisher, why they would do that. Why did they drop the epilogue?
I've always understood it to be an error.
Yeah,
It's-
I've always thought that the same thing that that it was an error, that not that it wasn't a purposeful thing. I mean, the British edition does cut all the sort of so much of the blasphemy as well as so much of the sexual references, but and cut one of the chapters, so they only have 134 chapters in the British edition. But I always thought the leaving off of the epilogue was just a mistake by the British publisher.
yeah, as
But of
simple as
course,
that. Thanks.
well, you might know that the reviews were quite critical for that reason. How is the reader supposed to know how this story is being told if there's no survivors? So the lack of an epilogue was seen as an artistic failure of the book. But interestingly, there were British writers later who very much admired the book at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, modernist writers like D.H. Lawrence. And I'm pretty sure they read the British edition that didn't have the epilogue and that it didn't seem to bother them. But of course, they were more open to experimental novel form and were less concerned with all of those questions being answered at the end of the book.
When I think about it, I always think of the first Pirates of the Caribbean, where the guy says, "No survivors, no survivors." Who told the story then? That was what was frustrating the British reviewers.
And so just one more thing, did Melville simultaneously send it to the British and the Americans? Or did he send it after the British
So
edition came out?
the only way, there was no international copyright. So in order to get any money from the book, it had to be published first in Great Britain. Once it was published in England, anybody could copy it. So the only way to get any money was to have it first there, and then he got paid some by that publisher, and then it was free reign for any other British publisher, which is why the British edition comes out before the American. But the American edition, so the plates were set, the American plates sent to Britain, and then they did all the taking out of all that stuff, and then the American edition comes out later. It's slightly later than the British edition.
And can I ask one more question?
Yeah, go for it.
Which edition did he give to Hawthorne?
I've always assumed it was the American
I'm
edition.
assuming the American since it had the epilogue.
Okay. Thank you.
But yeah, but I don't know.
And if I could go back in time, I've always thought that the one thing I would want to see is Hawthorne's letter to Melville, which Melville calls your joy-giving and exultation-breeding letter. And unspeakable security has been me this moment on account of your having understood. I've written a wicked book and feel spotless as a lamb. All that is in the letter in response to Hawthorne's letter. But then on the other hand, I always think if I actually could see Hawthorne's letter, maybe it wouldn't live up to my dream and imagination of how amazing that letter was.
Well, on the topic of reception, just before we close in the next few minutes here, I'm wondering if you can share with readers who maybe aren't familiar with the 19th century reception of Moby Dick, now being so familiar with it as the so-called great American novel, if you can share with them that history.
I mean, I can say a few things. I'm sure Mary Kay can add to it, but the sales were disappointing. The reviews were mixed. There were many reviewers who complained about the digressive chapters, about the lack of a coherent, sustained narrative. But there were other reviewers who admired things about it, the language. And we should remember that there was an audience for this kind of information about whaling and whaling life. The magnificent panorama that the New Bedford Whaling Museum has in its possession just shows that there was an audience for it. Why create a panorama like that unless people wanted to see what whaling life was like? But on the whole, the reviews, the sales were disappointing. What's really interesting to me is that the book was kept alive in English circles, that there were kind of avant-garde readers and writers and artists who were really drawn to Melville, Whitman, and Thoreau, that they considered all three of those writers to be really questioning kind of conventional bourgeois life. Melville, because he wrote about life in the South Seas, Thoreau, because he wrote about experimental living, Whitman, probably because he wrote about different kinds of sexuality. But those readers are really interesting to me and something I'd like to research more. And it comes as a surprise to people that this great American novel was actually better appreciated, arguably, in England than in the United States in this latter half of the 19th century.
And it's also really interesting, the Melville revival begins in the time between the two world wars. I think that's no accident. The after the First World War, kind of with the trauma felt by the whole world, Moby Dick seemed more relevant than it had to people earlier. So yeah, the fact that it just and I feel like Moby Dick is still in its ascendancy, still. I'm just amazed. I always feel like I've spent my life working on a book that's by a dead white male, by a dead white male about the killing of whales. Just seems like it would be as politically incorrect as possible, and yet it continues to be, cherished and loved by so many people.
Well, I look forward to hearing what future scholars have to say about the 2020s sort of Melville resurgence. I think that is all we have time for tonight. Thank you so much, everyone. Please give a virtual round of applause to our wonderful scholars. Read all of their books. Come meet them in person this January. This is our final session this year of the book club. Hopefully, we'll see what happens. Maybe we'll host a similar event next year in 2026 in the fall. In the meantime, please come visit us in New Bedford. Of course, you're invited to our annual Moby-Dick Marathon. That is not a running marathon, but rather a readathon of the entire book all the way through. It takes about 25 hours. We do that every January on the anniversary of Melville being here in New Bedford, departing from the harbor here. And that weekend features all kinds of fun events, including a Stump the Scholars event with all of the scholars you have met on these Zoom calls. And that is a blast with the coveted I Stumped the Scholars pin that you get to win if you bring in a question that they can't answer. There's also a theatrical performance of Chapter 40, which is famously written as a sort of play. The Bethel sermon, the chapel sermon, is read in the very Seaman's Bethel that inspired that scene where Melville himself worshipped. It's a blast. There are all kinds of activities for people of all ages. It's a free weekend. So we welcome you here this January. And we thank you so much, everyone. Your enthusiasm has been overwhelming. So please come and visit us. And for now, thank you for being part of this community. Keep in touch, take care of each other, and keep true to the dreams of thy youth. Good night.